Okay, well, welcome everybody to this One Nuclear session with Fish Richardson and with Mike Ward from Clarivate. And we have Teresa Levoy and Chad Shear. One of the benefits of One Nuclear is having relationships, not just strong relationships here in the UK and Europe, but actually with our partners and corporate sponsors such as Fish Richardson, who are based in the US side, which means we can have quite informed debates and up-to-date discussions and insights about the trends going on both sides of the Atlantic from people who are there doing the day job rather than what we're hearing by one step removed. So I'm delighted we have this chance today to hear from Teresa, Chad and Mike, which will be a discussion which they will run for the first 20 to 30 minutes, and then we will be opening up for questions and dialogue. But as we go along, do feel free to post things into the chat box. I'll keep an eye on that and flag them to Mike and as we go along, and they can work them into the discussion. Just on logistics, if we could just ask people to stay on mute when they're not speaking, just to allow us clarity. And the session is recorded and will be available post-event. So without more ado, we have Mike Ward, as I say, from Clarivate, Teresa Levoy and Chad Shear from Fish Richardson. I'll hand over to Mike to take us through. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Tony, and thanks for everybody for joining us. So the purpose is for us to sort of reflect on what happened in 2020 in the deal space, whether that be the the corporate deal making, whether that was by partnering or M&A activity, as well as also deal making where the industry tapped into the capital markets. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks just from the helicopter view that I have, and then I'm going to turn to Teresa and Chad to, I guess, because they're much more at the coalface, actually hear from that perspective of actually what was happening and what lessons we have learned from last year that will actually help us go moving forward. I guess the first thing was actually what a surprising year 2020 was. When the pandemic first emerged and there were clearly societal lockdowns, there were travel restrictions, there were concerns that this was going to be extraordinarily disruptive, both in terms of deal making, but also the activities of the pharmaceutical industry. What we actually saw was two things. First, actually, how adaptable the biopharma ecosystem actually is, in the way that it was not only able to respond to those specific day-to-day challenges of running a business when there are lockdowns, when there is requirements for social distancing, etc., but also from the way that the industry was able to pivot very, very quickly and take on what was the challenge of the year and probably for the coming years as well. And that was actually how to tackle COVID-19 in its various forms and actually develop medicines and treatments that were actually going to help patients. So, and that we saw your coalitions being created. We saw previous rivals actually getting together to work hand in hand, to tackle the challenges. And amazingly, within the space of in less than a year, we've actually seen the development and, in fact, the rollout of very, very effective vaccines to COVID-19. The expectation or the worry that there was going to be a massive slowdown in deal activity did not bear out. In fact, 2020 was a record year on a number of fronts. The amount of money, capital that was raised by the global biotech industry was hit record numbers, both at sort of the venture capital level, but also in initial public offerings. So it was clear that there was money to be made. It'll be interesting to sort of see how the road shows were conducted, and whether there are any sort of tips that we can learn for how best to pitch your story in a virtual environment. But also what we saw phenomenal activity in the biopartnering space. Now, quite a lot of this, about 25% of all the biopartnering deals that were tracked by BioWorld were COVID-19 related. But the value of the sort of almost 2,000 deals that were established in 2020 was worth in bio dollars almost $200 billion. Those COVID-19 ones were actually only accounted for a sort of a small percentage of that volume. On the M&A front, again, we actually saw merger and acquisition activity. We didn't see any sort of major mega deals. I guess the biggest one was the AbbVie deal with Allergan, which had started in 2019 and closed in 2020. And I guess that at the end of the year, AstraZeneca bidding $39 billion for Alexion are the two standout M&A deals. But there are some, and I'll ask Teresa and Chad to sort of pick out any sort of highlights that they had. What we saw was that there was not as much M&A activity that we'd seen before. Therefore the volume was down. But actually, what we're sort of seeing is we're still seeing quite a lot of activity. What will be interesting, though, is because a lot of these deals, traditionally take quite a bit of time to construct. It'll be interesting to sort of see what happened with the 6 months the last 6 months of 2020 and the inability for people to sort of move around, whether any new transactions or new conversations have been able to be created meaningfully. So those are just the background of what was going on. I'd sort of like now just to sort of turn to Teresa and Chad just to sort of give us if there are sort of any sort of specific highlights that they would like to reflect on before we go into get a little bit more granular on what was going on. So Teresa, would you like to unmute yourself? Thank you.
Sure, I can start and then Chad can jump in. I'm Teresa LeBoy. I'm a principal with Fish Richardson in our life sciences practice. And my practice largely focuses on small and emerging biotech and biopharma companies on both coasts of the United States and a few in Europe or the UK as well. And, I think when, early 2020, when the pandemic hit, we were all really concerned about what was going to happen, particularly to those smaller ones, right? They could get access to the labs. How were they going to go to partnering meetings? JP Morgan, at the end of last year, or excuse me, the beginning of this year, but at the end of the year, typically they start gearing up for that. What was going to happen to them? And, to our surprise and, knock on wood, it was just a slight hiccup, right? In terms of the advancement of the science and their deal making. And that deal making typically for those startups and emerging company are financings, and whether that's additional rounds, either the initial or additional rounds of funding or going public, or some alliance deals. And I think Chad's going to talk a bit more about alliances. One thing that we have seen continue in 2020 and perhaps accelerate are sort of new faces in investing in biotech. There's clearly a set and established group of VCs, serial funders of companies that have had a number of successful exits, and they are definitely continuing and increasing the size of their funds and really making an impact, particularly in some new and innovative cell and gene therapies, but also the size of the deals that they're doing. So massive Series A's in the United States, over 100 million, 200 million. And then the types of initial public offerings, whether it's a traditional one or through a special purchase acquisition vehicle, SPACs. We've seen a number of those. There was a big one for a cell therapy company, gene therapy, Humacyte, just recently. But some of the IPOs are on preclinical or sort of pre-preclinical data too, right? It's not that it's at that sort of phase 2 stage or even potentially phase 1. It's preclinical. And so perhaps later we can talk about, what might be driving that. Is it a bubble in the US? Is it sort of mania, everyone wanting to invest their money somewhere and just sort of following the lead? And if there are some failures there, what's that going to mean potentially, 2 or 3 years down the line for investors in that space? But I think that's, just the continued funding and the energy in the space is quite exciting to see. And we're hopeful for, as we're coming out of this pandemic, that it continues and we'll continue to see some great science and some great medicines for unmet needs.
Right. So Chad, do you just want to give some sort of initial comments around, the areas that you work on?
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. For those of you in the US, good morning. My name is Chad Shear. I'm a principal with Teresa at Fish Richardson. My practice is historically a little different than Teresa's. Teresa focuses more on the smaller startups, the emerging tech. I tend to represent the larger companies, and I'm a litigator by sort of experience and training. In the last couple of years, really the last 3 or 4 years, my practice has morphed, and while 85% of my time is still spent in the courtroom, 15 to 20% of it has been sucked into these deals, as more and more companies have been asking me for opinions on, let's call it the fuzzy edge of deals, where they're worried about bumping up against rivals. In part because I think it's fair to say that over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a rise in competitor. And so I've been pulled in earlier and earlier. And it's funny, in getting ready for this, I was looking at sort of the overall pace of deals for 2020 and trying to sort of at least address the fact that, for me anyway, it feels like we have been incredibly busy. Every time I talk to Teresa and I, if we're just going to catch up, it ends up being on a Saturday afternoon because that's the only time we can find to talk, because we've been just incredibly busy. And when I look at the overall value of deals in 2020, it's not that impressive of a number when you look at sort of history, especially when you account for the fact that the Alexion deal and Gilead's purchase of Immunomedics accounts for almost half of the total value of M&As. That was completely disconnected from what last year felt like. It felt like we were busier than ever. And when I started digging into the numbers, that was sort of what came out, was that while there haven't been as many M&A deals as there has in the past, and 2019 was a record-setting year, so maybe we were always going to head down a little bit. What we have seen is, if you look at the number of strategic alliances, which from a legal point of view require almost as much work as an M&A from an IP due diligence and those types of things, those numbers are just flat out through the roof. As more and more companies, because valuations are so high, companies, rather than a straight out acquisition, are looking for either a strategic alliance or picking off a couple of strategic assets for a key therapeutic area that can help spur their growth in some area that they deem critical. But if you look at just the raw numbers, 2020 was almost double the next highest year for the last decade. And in truth, I don't know that I see that trend changing for a while. With I think valuations, and Teresa, you can talk to this, I think valuations are going to stay high for a while. And so these mega deals like Alexion, like Immunomedics, I don't know that we're going to see a ton of those, but I think we're going to see even more, or at least a comparable number of these sort of strategic alliances. So sort of high level thoughts just at the outset.
Okay, so Chad, to just talk about the valuation of deals. Given the fact that the biotech sector was able to raise record sums of money, the need for them to secure do deals so that they could finance their activities wasn't as imperative as it has been in the past. So therefore, the valuations or the inflation of those valuations, what's that about? Is that because there are lots of potential buyers chasing few good opportunities, or is it because the potential sellers are, they're not, their feet aren't to the fire, so therefore actually they can hold out, and it's almost until somebody gives them an offer they can't refuse. So what is driving those valuations?
It's it's a really good question, and I don't know that I have a really good answer, and Teresa can jump in too. I think the answer, at least what my experience has been, is it's not only a combination of the two things that you said. A lot of potential buyers for the really good stuff. There's lots of potential buyers. What I've noticed, and Teresa, I'm curious if you've seen the same thing. What I've noticed is there's a lot of buyers for the bad stuff, for the stuff where you think that data doesn't look so good, or there might be freedom to operate issues, or those types of things. So it has felt like it's definitely a seller's market, and the buyers being cash rich has not only pushed the sellers to raise their price, but I can't tell you, and this is just me anecdotally from my own personal experience, and I don't have any actual data for this. I've seen a lot of deals fall through in the last year because buyer and seller are so far apart on price that no matter how creative they get in deal structure, they can't bridge the gap. And that can't last forever, obviously. But I can't tell you the number of times, and Teresa, I'm going to kick it over to you in a second. I can't tell you the number of times, Teresa, you've said to me, there is so much money out there, because a lot of this money, of course, is going after your clients. That in some ways it's creating sort of crazy math. So Teresa, let me let you comment on that one.
Sure, and I'm gonna put my camera off for just a second because my battery is running low. I have to plug in my computer. Apparently, it's unplugged. No, I completely agree with what you said, Tony and Chad. Tony, I do think that there is so much money out there that a lot of smaller companies are saying, I can do this on my own, right? I don't need to sell off, right? And there's also people who have been successful, have brought products, all the way through the clinic, right, and gotten approval. And so there's that sort of, if they can do it, I can do it.
Okay, it looks like we've lost Teresa. So so coming back to this is the beauty of doing these things live. Looking at the transactions that have taken place, and apart from the ones that were clearly sort of driven by COVID-19 and COVID-19 concerns, I'm just wondering whether just the length of time it takes to initially create these deals actually means that we actually haven't seen the impact of those travel restrictions or societal lockdowns on the creation of new conversations. I mean, do you have a sort of a sense that actually the ideation of those deals is still taking place at a rapid rate?
You know, it's a really good question, Mike. I moderated a panel discussion for a group of, it wasn't lawyers, it was business executives, about 2 months ago. And I asked that very question. I had a panel of CEOs, all the way from a panel of CEOs and BD guys, all the way from, you know, large Eli Lilly sized companies down to small Israeli startups. And I asked that very question. And I was stunned by the answer, because I thought the answer was going to be absolutely. We are so hemmed in. This is making deals and transactions. It's making the origination of deals difficult, and it's making closing the transactions impossible. And the answer that I got was exactly the opposite. And what they said was that a couple of things. First, they have become more reliant on old networks. And old connections, but also sort of meetings like this one, where you get a group of people together virtually by Zoom and you meet, and a lot of these, I don't know how many people in the audience have participated in sort of these online conferences where there's little breakout rooms where you can chat with people during those kinds of things. And they said that they've been able to meet people that way. But the biggest surprise to me, because I really thought that the inability to travel would be a major roadblock. The biggest surprise to me was what the CEO of this Israeli startup said. What he said was, because his company is all about sort of creating early stage assets and spinning them off. That's basically the model for his company. And what he said was, COVID-19 has made it 10,000 times easier to get the right stakeholder on the phone so that he can have a conversation with them. Because all of a sudden, because people aren't sitting in airports and on planes and, you know, all of that, they find themselves with more free time. And it's not the end of the world to schedule a half an hour meeting to sort of, you know, mock a few things out and see if there's a potential for some sort of strategic alliance or relationship. And so I haven't seen, and this is just my personal experience and my experience from participating in some conferences, I haven't seen necessarily a slowdown in the ideation. What I have seen, and we have Teresa back, so Teresa can comment on this for sure. What I have seen is it's taking a little longer to close deals. And I don't mean on the financial side. I frankly don't. I'm on the legal side, not the financial side. But on the legal side, it's taking a little bit longer to close deals, in part because people are pulled in so many more directions than they used to be, because at least the folks that I deal with are busier than they used to be. And I don't know how those trends, I don't know what's causing it. I don't know how those trends align. But Teresa, I don't know if you were able to hear Mike's question. Mike's question at a high level was basically the impact of the pandemic on not only past deals, but more importantly, sort of creating and generating future deals.
Mm-hmm. And I apologize. I think my cats unplugged my computer last night, so it totally died. That hasn't happened before. I apologize. But I came in, Chad, when you were saying, you know, a colleague was saying is more calls and more time through Zoom or Teams or whatever it might be, and I'm seeing exactly that with my clients. They can, in the past, if they were traveling, you know, they lose a day on either end of a long trip. If they were going across coast or across over to the UK or Europe, that lost travel time, that lost downtime is gone now, right? People can schedule from early in the morning to late at night, meet lots of people, and I think are more receptive to seeing more of those opportunities. So I think that pace has increased, which then correlates with, on the legal side for Chad and I, more clients saying, hey, can you do some quick due diligence, some deep due diligence, or follow up on things, and wanting an answer the next day, right? Or the next week, not, you know, it might have been 2 or 3 weeks in the past because they were traveling, someone else was gone, now it's sort of everyone's gets up, sits at their computer, stays there all day, and can keep that moving. And so I think there's just a higher volume and exposure of deals. But as Chad said, I think finishing, closing those deals is a lot more things pulling at people in terms of opportunities. And so they're juggling all of those and, wanting to make sure that, despite the fact that there might be a lot of cash around there, that they still want to make wise investments. And it brings back another point too of relationship building. I think it's important, and I think people are trying to not get too caught up in the frenzy, but really understanding that, hopefully we are going to come out of this. We are going to have some sort of alliance, collaboration, acquisition. We need to make sure that those relationships will work well. And so, trying to build those relationships through Zoom or Teams or whatever you might be using is important to, not rush too much in that, and to understand that it does take some time to get to that point of comfort and understanding that, beyond saying the deal is done, okay, now actually executing on the purpose of that deal, right? But I think that has people are aware of that and are trying to make sure that they take that into consideration in terms of closing these deals.
Right. So just thinking about that, the closing of the deals, because obviously, whether it's a financing or whether it's a sort of strategic alliance, there has to be due diligence. And I just wonder, in the remote environment, how confident are you that it is still possible to conduct robust due diligence? Chad, would you like to go first?
Sure, happy to. So it's an interesting point, Mike, and because I have to tell you, for the last 5 years, all of my diligences have been remote. I've never had one that I wasn't either sitting at my office, sitting at my desk, or sometimes I'll go and sit in an office at a client site. But all of the deals that I've been involved with that have gone all the way from start all the way up through closing, the diligence, especially the last week of diligence, when you're right at the edge of signing and finalizing the deal and you're trying to get stuff done, it's always been, people open up a data room and people have access to the data room, and from that perspective, I think from the legal perspective, I think we haven't been hampered in any way as far as sort of a robust diligence. I think on the other hand, on the scientific side, it's been a little more challenging, just because you can't inspect sites, you can't inspect manufacturing facilities, those types of things. But Teresa, has your experience been the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, Chad, some of the bigger due diligence, bigger acquisitions of some of my startup and emerging companies over the past few years, it's largely through a data room and lots of Zoom calls, because the parties are all over the world, essentially looking at the IP, for example. I think that the clinical and the scientific diligence typically, was traditionally done in person, and particularly on the M&A side, wanting to build that relationship, to make sure the teams that you're acquiring are going to be working with are going to fit together well, and to really inspect that data. I think that probably has been an issue with clients in terms of doing some deals during the pandemic. I think people have tried to address ways to do it, but I think that's one of the bigger reasons for some slowdowns, is just that hesitancy about not being able to sort of sit around the table with the clinical data and the people involved in the clinical trials, and really sort of be able to dig in and hash it out, rather than have a PowerPoint that's set to go and you go through it, right? It's more of that, okay, we're just going to dig in together on this and ask questions as they come up. Zoom requires, a little bit more of preparation and maybe less spontaneity, right? And people just want to get off of it at some point, rather than, when you're sitting around a table and able to interact directly with people and continue to ask questions and probe a bit more. So, but I think from the legal side, it really, we've moved to this point, and the pandemic has accelerated that a lot can be done virtually, right? That people understand how to set up data room, what needs to be in it, how to set up restrictions on it. We can review, a lot of information is publicly available. We can look at it. So I think, in many ways, the pandemic just accelerated previous trends in terms of that type of diligence.
Okay, just sort of, a quick question. You both mentioned how the sort of the deal flow that you're dealing with has been sort of intense in the past year, and particularly in this sort of this virtual environment. I just wonder whether you are able to share any sort of tips of what is best practice, in this world, but also where there are things that people should avoid, like the plague or like COVID-19. So are there sort of like good do's and don'ts that you could share? So Teresa, would you like to start? I mean, when raising capital, there must be some horror stories that you've seen.
So from the earlier side, that the startup and earlier side, it's people get very excited and they often need the money and want the money. They have plans for it, their science, their R&D, their clinical development plans. Making sure that you're not revealing too much before you have your patent applications in place, for example. There's that tension with, wanting to show everything when maybe, it's not ready yet to file the patent on. You want to build that excitement with your potential partner. Same thing with, if there's questions around, do you have freedom to operate, or who are the other big players in the space? Are you concerned about patentability? This willingness to sort of jump out there and say, hey, I had this lawyer write an opinion for us and here it is, right? Like sort of giving up some of your attorney-client privilege by revealing that. So that's a little better these days. And that's a consequence, I think, of that it is a seller's market, as Chad was saying, right? And so whereas in the past, people might have been more willing to, here are my structures, here's my early data, sort of, show a lot more. Now, because they're typically maybe more parties interested, are much more willing to say, I'm not going to give you that information. You sort of have to do your diligence on here's my patent application. And I'll tell you my lead is in there, but I'm not going to tell you what the structure is, right? And you can do your FTO analysis, and you can do, your scientific and clinical analysis and see. So it's a little bit of that, the power dynamic has shifted a bit, as we've said, it's a bit of a seller's market. And then the level of data, it's much more preclinical for a lot of these deals, right? It's not to the clinical stage that's necessary. Anyway, Chad, would you like to jump in? We've had conversations about this, many where we've seen some issues.
Yeah, I mean, this is unfortunately, this ends up being my bread and butter. This ends up, the do's and the don'ts. It's people who exercise and the don'ts that it always seems to end up in my lap 5 or 6 years down the road when there's a couple $1 billion at stake in litigation. So just at a high level, Mike, to your point, to your question, sort of the do's and don'ts and in this sort of new environment. So one thing that this Zoom culture has created, as we're all sort of invited into each other's houses, albeit virtually. And you guys are all watching. My wife rescued a couple of puppies. That was our COVID-19 good deed, and they're wandering around in the background behind me, getting into all kinds of mischief and mayhem. It creates an informality that we didn't have before, and an informality translates to a pseudo familiarity that isn't actually true. I point that all out because the end result is people are far more likely to say things that they shouldn't because they're sitting in their house. They're not sitting in an office. They're not sitting in a conference room. And some of their guards have come down. So, so the definite don't is don't say too much. Just because the meeting is happening in your living room doesn't mean that the people on the other side are your friends. On the do's side, track absolutely everything. One of the downsides to this virtual world we all live in is it's really, really easy to share data. And it's really easy to share data in a way that is not easy to prove later that you shared something. So sort of stick to your P's and Q's, have a data room, and actually track things. The other huge thing, and this goes back to the familiarity, informality part, actually prep for meetings. I can't tell you the number of times where I've been involved in a due diligence Zoom meeting with the other side, and sometimes it's the folks on my side, sometimes it's the folks on the other side. They're just not ready for the meeting in the same way that they might if they had to get on a plane and take a cab and end up in somebody's conference room. And it can make for not only really big inefficiencies, but when you're not prepared for the meeting and you feel like you have to fill time, you start saying things you shouldn't. You start disclosing things you shouldn't. And in the end of the day, these people on the other side of the table are still adverse parties until sometime in the future. So Teresa and I have actually given a bunch of webinars on sort of deep in the weeds do's and don'ts for these kinds of things that are just sort of general practice tips as opposed to not necessarily COVID related ones. But those would be the COVID related ones that I'd highlight.
Yeah, so it sounds like, be careful, they're not your friends.
That's right.
So even though they've invited you into their living room. So talking about the fact that again with attraction, that people are more available to have conversations, and therefore we're sort of seeing sort of deal activity not take a downturn. I'm just wondering, it used to be said, and the reason why bio clusters sort of developed as hotspots for biotech, that people they'd like to do deals with people that were within an hour of where they were. So you saw all the sort of pharma companies and the venture capitalists around Cambridge, Massachusetts. They tend to back those sort of companies. So similarly with the Bay Area or San Diego, and we saw it in Europe, and we saw therefore a concentration of activity, and we saw the growth of San Diego, Bay Area, and Massachusetts. I was just wondering, the fact that now people aren't having to travel, there isn't that restriction. Does that mean that actually sort of deal creation and deal establishment actually is potentially more geographic agnostic than it might have been in the past? Teresa, would you like to comment first?
I absolutely agree that it will be more geographic agnostic in terms of deal. The VCs or the companies, with the money looking for deals and looking for good science, right? I think the ecosystem has developed enough. It's not a baby anymore, right? It's been around since the 80s now, right? So there are enough people who have done this, come up through the ranks at big pharma, big biotech, or small pharma to big, get acquired, who've seen it and done it, who've been successful, that there isn't so much that, there's only a cluster of people in these regions. There are more people distributed in more geographies. The question though then comes back to, when you're building that company, where's the talent going to be, right? And do you need to have the talent? Are they all in Cambridge? Are they all in San Francisco or San Diego or some hotspots in Europe? Because that's where they grew up through biotechs or pharma. And so that's, they want to be able to go across the street for their next job, or their spouse or partner needs to be able to have a job. And so, is it sort of a self-reinforcing issue? And, I think that was the case for a while. And it sort of is potentially leading to its own downfall now in terms of lab space, right? You can't find lab space in Cambridge or San Francisco anymore, right? And if you can, it's incredibly expensive, right? And so, how do you, while the deals may be bigger, that you're spending a lot more money for the talent, because salaries also increasing, going up because of the attrition. The ability to retain is so difficult because it is this seller's market in terms of, I got the next round of financing and I'm going to hire the best people. And so people are moving around. So I think, it will be interesting to see coming out of this if more of the clusters that haven't gotten as much attention in Europe, the UK, the United States, if it will develop there because of, people not wanting to live in San Francisco anymore because of the expense, right? Or the, 2-hour commute to get to their job if they have to work in the lab. And, not all of us can do our jobs remotely, right? There are people that have to actually go into a space that has the equipment and the hoods and the settings that they need. That's what this industry is really founded on, right? Is the fundamental science, and then the clinical work that's done is so you can't do all of that remotely. So seeing how that plays out over the next few years, I think will be really interesting to see what lessons, what can be done virtually and making sure we get the most of that, but then figuring out, do we need to have our lab in, Cambridge, Mass, for example, or San Francisco or Cambridge, UK, right? Or can we do it somewhere else, right? Is there enough talent out there? Is there enough general knowledge and understanding? And then a theme you brought up at the beginning, and it'd be good to explore, Mike, a little bit more, is this idea of successful collaborations, alliances, collaborations, right? And I think the industry should be extremely proud of the successes over the past year, and I think we should make more of it, right? That these rivals came together, right, at record speed to do this, and we should do that more, right, in terms of neurodegenerative diseases. There are a lot of other pandemic diseases, right, that if we put that same sort of level of collaboration and innovation and sense of urgency to them, I think we could see just incredible things happen. So I'll stop and let you and Chad jump in.
So actually, on that point where we saw the collaboration, and the fact is that a model that could be replicated for example, tackling neurodegenerative diseases? I'm just wondering, Chad, in the sort of, the conversations, or, when you're eavesdropping on conversations, do you kind of get a sense that there might be an appetite for people to work in similar ways in different indications, and not just because there was a potential existential crisis around COVID-19?
In a word, no. But that's because of the world that I live in. I get called in when people have come to blows and hate each other. And what my experience has been is that the global pandemic has been willing to make sort of unlikely bedfellows come together and do things together in the interest of just sort of where we are globally. I haven't seen that same willingness to collaborate outside of the pandemic, and in fact, what I have seen is even more competition in the other areas where competitors have historically butted heads. I think the one, at least legal thing that I guess we do have to keep in mind is this, that there are a lot of these companies that are so large that they can't collaborate, that at least under US antitrust laws and perhaps anti-competitive laws in Europe, and I'm not going to profess to be an expert on those, they couldn't collaborate if they wanted to. Now, COVID-19, all of those concerns get set aside, and nobody's worried about enforcing antitrust laws or or frankly, enforcing patents. I mean, when's the last time that you've seen, somebody come out with a bunch of new therapies and new medications, and there hasn't been a single lawsuit? So I think there's been a willingness to look past a couple of what I'll call strategic competitive tactics, or competitive strategic tactics, however you want to say it, that there's been a willingness to set those aside in the interest of global public health that I don't think is going to transfer to other therapeutic areas, at least on the bigger side of things.
Right, sure. Which of course is a shame, I guess. But sort of you're looking at that, the around, so for example, you mentioned sort of antitrust. There's a new administration in the States, and that actually has control of both houses as well as the presidency, and there are prominent voices that actually are very, very keen to rein in the activities of big knowledge intensive industries like the tech industry and like the pharmaceutical industry. So for example, Katie Porter, who's from California, a Democrat from California, she produced a paper 2 or 3 weeks ago, which was sort of basically calling for greater sort of control on M&A activity. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on, even if it doesn't take place, the fact that these conversations are taking place now and are very prominent, that might actually take some of the wind out of the excitement around what's been happening in the sort of the biopharma space. Chad, do you want to have first throws, and then it'd be interesting to sort of see if there are repercussions for capital raising as well. So Chad.
Sure. So I'm of many minds when it comes to this, because I feel like no matter what I say, I can talk myself out of it pretty easily, just depending what day of the week it is. I think right now there's a fair amount of uncertainty about what's going to happen and what the new administration is going to choose to enforce. I think if you look at, so I used to live in Delaware, and I used to bump into now President Biden all the time. Delaware is a tiny state, and and the thing that is, if you look at the economic culture in Delaware, where he's from and he lives, that was the global home for AstraZeneca for years, and for DuPont, and it really was sort of this, for lack of a better way of saying it, intellectual-based economy that he always was supportive of. New now, he's not new anymore. Chris Coons, the senator from Delaware, who was very influential in getting President Biden elected, is a big champion of the pharmaceutical industry. Now, how that plays and contrasts with the rest of the Democratic Party and how they want to enforce things, remains to be seen. And so that's why I can talk myself out of almost anything when it comes to this, because I just don't know. I think in the end of the day, at least in the US, we're going to have so many competing interests and so many stakeholders with completely divergent ideas that we're always going to have to not only keep our eyes open, but I guess I would say it this way: we're always going to have people willing to push the envelope no matter what. And whether or not things get enforced, or whether or not laws get created so that they can be enforced, I think we'll have to wait and behold. But I do think that at least short term, there's going to be a slight chill until people get used to whatever the new normal is. I don't know, Teresa, do you have good thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you, Chad. I think there's a lot of other things that need to get taken care of first in the United States right now that may be higher priority. I do think, there has been a trend in terms of cell therapies and gene therapies in particular, right? Thinking about the pricing of those, right? And how can we do it? Because it's not sustainable have a $2 million price tag, right, on these therapies for each one, for any government. And so I think, it would be useful. I think it's an opportunity for the pharmaceutical and biotech industry to think about that and be promoting, proposing ideas for how to move forward, whether it's a value-based approach, towards, efficacy and paying out that way. Because, with reimbursement, insurers, and it will come to a point where it will be unsustainable. And if you look at the dollar values going into cell and gene therapy now, those deals, and then the price tags coming out, it really is going to come to a point where we have to start having those conversations about how do we price this appropriately in a way that recognizes the effort and the intellectual contribution, and promotes that science, but at the same time makes it so that that science is that the medicines are actually accessible to the people that need them, right? Because if they're not paid for, if they're not reimbursed, and they're not getting out there, then it was all in vain. So I do think it is an opportunity for the industry to really sort of take that step and try to start moving that forward. As they did with the COVID-19 crisis. I think it's really an opportunity for drug pricing going forward for us to try to lead the way there, right? And to better our reputation, right, going forward. And I think take advantage of that. Now, show what a great job I think that the industry has done in this pandemic, and then show what we can do as leaders going forward on this.
Yeah. Just to come back to what was happening in sort of the capital raising. We've seen a lot of money has been raised, particularly at IPOs. In 2020, one of the interesting IPO models was in fact this the special purpose acquisition company, the SPAC. In fact, F-Star, which is a company from Cambridge, UK, actually went public via a SPAC. I just wonder, whether you could sort of share with us, whether this is something that actually is going to be even more influential. Sort of the SPAC approach for companies to go public, and what the sort of the upsides but the potential downsides that people should be aware of when sort of thinking about going the SPAC route.
I think it will continue to be popular. For a while, I still think there is a lot of capital out there that wants to take this sort of approach to bringing a company public. I think things to be aware of is if it's too early, if it's too preclinical, and they don't hit the milestones, right, or there's some negative results, that could, just like the regular public markets, that could cause a chill, particularly on that type of vehicle. I think people are going to look closely at, was this the traditional model or the SPAC model, and maybe was there enough diligence done around that, right? So they're going to look very closely at that and, try to read the tea leaves and try to say it was because it was this versus that, right? I think you're going to have to carefully look at the science and the clinical development underneath, and the teams, the leadership teams of those companies as well. I just think generally, for the amount of money that's going into these deals, that particularly preclinical ones, it's really going to be a focus on, are they hitting their milestones, and what's coming out of those deals, and that's going to be playing out not for a few years though, right? So because some of them are so early stage that we may not see the results of that for a few years.
All right. So, I mean, this has been a fantastic discussion. We're almost up to time. I mean, there's plenty of other things that we could probably carry on this conversation for about another hour or so. What I thought, though, would be just to sort of get your thoughts on how you sort of think this year is going to pan out, and and what might sort of, derail the sort of the momentum that we actually saw in 2020. So on the sort of on the deal front, Chad, do you want to kick off first?
Sure, and I see the time, and we'll be brief. And I also feel like I'm playing with fire as the puppies are now awake and engaging in mayhem behind me. I'm pretty optimistic about 2021. I think for two reasons. One, I think that there were, at least in my own personal life, professional life, there were a lot of deals in the works in the fall and winter of 2020 that we just didn't get to. But the other part is, I mean, I just know with our law firm, and when I talk to clients, they're sort of looking at it the same way. I mean, everybody, fingers crossed, is thinking the world's going to pretty much open up in August. And I think that what we're going to see is just a build up, like this, sort of the water built up behind a dam. And I think we're going to see a bunch of work leading up to that. And then I think there's a huge potential for the second half of 2021 to just really go crazy, for lack of a better way of saying it.
I would agree with Chad. This is Teresa. Something that could derail it. I mean, we had a pandemic last year in the United States. We had riots. We had, civil unrest. We had an insurrection. It's still sort of powering on. I think we're going to see some of the impact, the true economic impact, playing out this year, which, could cause some issues. The stock market was sort of divorced from economic reality in the United States. And we will see some of that playing out this year, but, I'm hopeful. One thing that could derail it is if everyone feels like I do and wants to go on vacation in September and October because they haven't been able to travel, the whole world could be taking September and October off and not doing any deals. But I think, as Chad said, that's not going to happen. I think there's going to be so much pent up demand that even if we want to take a vacation, we won't be able to at that point.
The idea of taking August off, just welcome to Europe. That's exactly what we do. But looking at sort of things that might slow things down, I was just, and we kind of mentioned about the fact that not everybody can work remotely. So actually, some of the important work that's done is done in the lab, and we do know that some clinical trials were put on hold, or they certainly weren't able to operate in the same way. And I just wonder whether there might be some sort of hangover associated with the fact that some of the clinical activity wasn't able to take place last year.
I'll speak to that quickly. I was on listening to a discussion the other day with someone pretty high up at the FDA, and they've done a fantastic job this year and over the past few years dealing with cellular and gene therapies and sort of really engaging and providing advice. So on the COVID vaccines and antibodies, and then on the cellular and gene therapies, and they're exhausted there, right? But it shows that if you can have that level of interaction with the FDA, that they are truly trying to be a partner and collaborate with you and move things forward. I think if we, on the US side, invest in that, support the FDA, then theoretically they could pivot, right, to this pent up demand of these other clinical trials, whether it's oncology, neurodegenerative disease, IO, whatever, and pivot that way. But I do think we need to invest in that because they're exhausted after this past year of moving things forward. And I'm sure it's the same at the EMEA.
Great. Okay. Look. Well, thanks very much. We're at time. I'm going to hand back to Tony.
Okay. Thank you, Teresa, Chad, and Mike, for what I thought was a fascinating discussion and plenty of room for optimism. Although with a caution of remembering not everybody in your living room is your friend, or at least not at the start of the discussion. Although I think Chad's puppies probably are friends behind him, so he's on safe territory. But with that, I think you raised a lot of really interesting points. And thanks to all those who contributed questions in the chat box, either openly or privately. And I hope we'll see many of you back at future events. But for now, thanks to our corporate sponsors at Fish Richardson. And to Mike, your expert chairing as always. and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thanks, folks.